Well, hello everybody again. This is Dr. Tim Cote talking to you late at night here on the East Coast for the Keck Graduate Institute, which is over on the West Coast. Today we're talking Lecture 8, the medical device approval process. And this was an interesting chapter. This is Chapter 7, Lecture 8, because Chapter 5 had a Part A and a Part B. It's not an area of FDA regulation that I was as familiar with, so I did a little bit of learning along the way. The regulation of medical devices is extremely complex, but it is fairly new, to tell you the truth, because the reason it's complex is because such a diversity of products are included, from Band-Aids to CAT scans and everything in between. Medical devices pretty much rule the world of healthcare. It's every bit as critical as drugs, and the systems are becoming blurred between medical devices and drugs. Before 1976, so today we're going to go over the 510K process, the PMA process, and a little bit about IDEs, as well as these broader questions of how medical devices are regulated. So before 1976, there was no specific device regulation. At that point, from 38 until 76, it relied upon extension of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. In 1976, the medical device amendments brought some vast expansions of the powers of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to work on medical devices. Like drugs, safety and effectiveness are the watchwords. So that same kind of thinking that the product should be proven to be safe and effective applies to medical devices. And it's the way that we think about them, like drugs, that you have to demonstrate the efficacy, you have to demonstrate the safety, you have to do adverse event monitoring the same way as you do for drugs. So the further amendments that we'll talk about today were the collection of user fees. There was some expanded access to several different amendments, such as FDAMA, you'll hear about that, and FDA, FDA MA, and FDAAA, respectively, brought increased powers to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and increased authority to approve and clear devices and to increase the transparency of the process. So let's say, what is a medical device? It is on page 172 in our little book here, which we've become so familiar with, and which I've destroyed my copy from heavy use. I hope you've done the same. And 72 says that a medical device is an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or similar related article, including any component, part, or accessory which is 1. Recognized in the official national formulary of the United States Pharmacopoeia, where have we heard that before in the definition of drugs, or any supplement to them. 2. Intended for the use in the diagnosis of disease or conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or animal. Sounds like drugs again. 2, we're taking that model and extending it to these devices. Or 3, intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals which does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action, so it's excluding drugs from the device definition, within or on the body of man or animals, and which is not dependent upon being metabolized for the achievement of its primary intended purpose. So the metabolism business and the chemical action, that's drugs. Okay? So what is a device? It is a drug that isn't a drug. Okay? So the classification, so there's a very important date in drug regulation classification. That date is May 28th, 1976. Anything that was out there before then was called a pre-amendment device. Anything after then was a post-amendment device. So it was regulated by the amendment. Now, if it's not a pre-amendment device, It's categorized into one of three classes based upon the amount of control that's required in order to assure safety and effectiveness. Class 1 only require general controls. They are the devices that represent the least threat of safety problems. Class 2 requires general controls and special controls. Okay, and Class 3 are the most regulated. They require full-blown pre-market approval in addition to general and special controls. So FDA has taken like 1,700 types of devices, and it's grouped them into the various medical specialties and classified them according to these three levels of classification. So, Class 1 devices, this includes things like elastic bandages, exam gloves, surgical instruments. I don't know where thermometers would be. Maybe this is where they'd be. They require general controls. Well, what are general controls? The facility has to be registered. The product has to be listed. Records have to be maintained. Reports have to be filed. There has to be adherence to a special kind of good manufacturing practice called Quality Systems Regulations, or QSRs. Okay, these are specific for devices. And any distribution limitations that are imposed by FDA could still be imposed upon Class 1 products. FDAMA of 1997 exempted all Class 1 devices from pre-market notification requirements unless it was, quote, of substantial importance, or, quote, there was a potentially unreasonable risk. So this is a pattern you'll see repeated, where we make a general rule, but then we allow ourselves the possibilities of having lots of exceptions to that rule. So those ones which the FDA has decided might be of a substantial importance or potentially unreasonable risk are called Class 1 reserved devices. Examples of Class 1 reserved devices include blood banking supplies, keratomes, ventricular cannulas, or positron cameras. So many Class 1 devices are exempt from the QSR, but some are exempt from the QSR except for the record keeping. So again, there's this flexibility even within the classes, that once we say it's in a class, it doesn't mean that that particular product has to follow all the rules of those classes. There may be particular subclasses within the class. Class 2 devices have general controls plus, quote, special controls. Okay, these include such medical devices as powered wheelchairs, infusion pumps, surgical drapes. Most Class 2 devices will require a 510K clearance, and we'll talk about 510K in a moment. The sponsor notifies FDA of its intent to manufacture with data on equivalence. Okay, and we'll talk about that when we get to the 510K issues. However, in 1997, FDAMA listed some Class 2s as exempted from the 510K requirement. Still, you have to submit a 510K if the device is intended for lay use, where it was previously only reserved for professionals, or if it operates using a different technology than originally. So, for example, a laser blade versus a metal scalpel blade, or the use of a DNA probe rather than an ELISA test for an in vitro diagnostic. Okay, Class 3 devices, these are the scary ones. These are the ones that have the greatest potential for serious safety issues. They have to receive a pre-market approval. They are life-sustaining or life-supporting or implantable. They usually require a full-blown PMA, and we'll talk about the PMA as well. The PMA is the device equivalent of the NDA, of the new drug application. The 510K doesn't have a... the 510K in some ways is comparable of the... It has some similarities to generic drugs. We'll explain why in a moment. So Class 3 devices have to receive pre-market approval. They usually require PMA. They include things like heart valves, silicone breast implants, drug-eluting stents. Okay? So there is this other notion. It is brought up in the book. It's a very restricted category called custom devices. It relates to Section 520G. That's 520G of the food. That's the 510K business, the 520G. These are all amendments from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So they are exempt from registration if they are ordered by a physician. They are not available in finished form. They are not labeled for commercial distribution. Custom medical devices can... let me get on to my next page of notes. They're exempt from the 510K, but they still have all the general controls, including the QSR, and custom devices are strictly interpreted by the FDA. So there is this. You should know there's this category of custom devices that if you are a doc and you want to make something that's just perfect for your patient, it may fit into that category, but the FDA generally takes a very restricted view of what a custom device is. So you can, if your device is classified as one category or another, get it changed. Okay, they can change from class 2 to class 3 to class 2, or class 2 to class 1. Reclassification, though, is for the generic type. It involves a process. You have to make an application. So if you get your product, your kind of product, reclassified from a category 3, which is more restricted, involves more regulatory work, into a category 2, be aware that all your competitors who make your same thing are also getting their products reclassified at the same time. So it does benefit the competitors. It often requires a citizen's petition. There's a citizen's petition process for it, and there's a guidance for how to get your product reclassified that you can read, and then you'll know how to file that reclassification petition. The book talks a little bit about convenience kits. I'll leave that to you all to read. Part 800 of the CFR describes and classifies products, says what they all are and which category, class 1, class 2, class 3, they all fit. If a new device is not classified, then the sponsor has to determine the regulatory pathway on their own by looking at competitor products and other products that have gone on that are sort of similar. A pre-submission meeting with CDRH, as always, is a really good idea, just as a pre-IND meeting. These we might call a pre-IDE meetings. And there is information under section 513G for how to request said meeting. We talked about the guidance, and I think that many of those things that we talked about in the guidance would similarly apply. If you submit a 510K and you are not found to be substantially equivalent, and we'll get to this concept. So the 510K works like this. Let me take a step from my notes. There's two main ways you get a device approved. Two main ways. We're going to talk about some of the other offshoot ways as well. There were two main ways to get it to market. One is the PMA. That's like the NDA of drugs. You got to go out, you got to do the clinical trials, you got to show that it's safe and effective. The other is this thing called a 510K. It refers to the 510K section. And for it, you have to show substantial equivalence to a predicate device. That's an important thing, okay? Substantial equivalence to a predicate device. The predicate is some other product which has already been approved, maybe by a 510K, or maybe by a PMA, or maybe it was a pre-amendment device, came in before the 1970s. But if you can demonstrate that it is substantially equivalent to something else, then you can get your 510K and you can bring the thing to market, because that's a marketing approval. Now, this is, as you might expect, problematic. Now we are to 2011 is this year, and there was just a report by the Institute of Medicine saying, hey, this 510K process is broken, because if they're getting an approval today on a predicate device, if the device that I put forward is the device Z, and it has a device Y, which it was its predicate, but device Y has a device X, which was its predicate, which device X has the device W, which was its predicate. We'll go all the way back to A or something, and A doesn't look anything like Z looked like. See what I'm saying? So this is both the bane and the beauty of device regulation, is that, and 510Ks are not insubstantial. They actually represent the vast majority of device approvals come through the 510K process. PMAs are reserved for things like Class 3 products, and they actually represent a fairly small proportion of all device approvals. So the Institute of Medicine came out with this report, and they were quite concerned about the fact that the integrity of the system is lost when you have this telephone tag kind of communication that goes through the decades. Devices are also quite different from drugs in that, unlike a drug, which you have a new molecular entity, it's a chemical that's different, it's decidedly different when it's a chemical. In drugs, in devices, you usually improve it a little bit, and then improve it a little bit, and then improve it a little bit. So they're constantly changing in small increments. Whereas a new chemical entity, yes, we have Me Too drugs. Yes, we have things that are, just have an extra methyl group here, but that tends to really affect the drug, and it's easier to define as well. So the point is, so we got these two major processes by which devices are approved, the PMA and the 510K. And I think I've given you the overview now. So the predicate device. But if you submit the 510K and you're found not to be substantially equivalent, and therefore a Class 3, because you're a brand new thing, whenever you're a brand new thing, you're automatically going to the Class 3 category. Because there's no predicate device, then you're faced with this issue of, I have to do a PMA. Now the sponsor can request an immediate reclassification into Class 1 or Class 2 based on its low risk. Let's say there's something that's really low risk, but there's no predicate device. So it gets submitted, they say, there's no predicate device, boom, you're automatically Class 3. The sponsor can say, oh, no, it's obviously a low risk device, can I have Class 2 or Class 1, please? And this is called a de novo review process. The agency, the request has to be made within 30 days of being notified that you're not substantially equivalent to this other thing that you thought you were, or to anything else that you could think of. If you are reclassified, then you can go straight to market, and your device can be a predicate device for somebody else's 510K, okay? But if you stay a Class 3, you got to go out and get your PMA, and that is expensive because you got to prove safety and efficacy. You got to do clinical trials. You enroll people. You see whether they get better or not. MDUFA, the Medical Device User Fee Act, that's the device side of PDUFA, stipulates all kinds of user fees for 510K applications, PMAs, BLAs, because CDRH regulates some BLAs, pre-market reports, product development protocols, we can talk about that shortly, panel track PMA supplements, BLA efficacy supplements, blah, blah, blah. Any kind of regulatory action you want to do with devices, there's probably going to be a MDUFA fee for it as well. FDA 2007 restructured MDUFA, and now MDUFA goes up to 2012, which is only next year. They're working on the thing now, and they're having a huge fight over how much it should be paid. In the drug side, PDUFA, drug user fees, pay for about 60–70% of all of the reviewer fees. And we talked about the ethical concerns and considerations there. On the device side, MDUFA is only paying for about 20% of device fees right now, and so there are some who want to see it pay up for a larger share of the agency's operating costs, and some others in industry who don't want to pay the fees to begin with. So they are very different industries. Going on, so there are performance goals in MDUFA, just as there are in PDUFA. You set a clock as well. Well, in MDUFA, the people who are doing the reviews, who are receiving, the federal employees whose money has come through these user fees, are also set to a particular clock as well. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about IDEs. Those are investigational device exemptions. So just like INDs are investigational new drugs, and that is an exemption, the IDE is an exemption as well, and it's an exemption from needing to have a license in order to be able to do interstate shipment. And in this case, it's exempted because you're investigating it. So the IDE is the equivalent in device land as the IND, the investigational new drug, is to the drug land. It's a permission to go out and use this article in an investigatory sense before you actually can market it and sell it. Okay? So it's not approved for commercial distribution when you have an IDE, your device isn't, but that permits interstate shipment. It does exempt you from those provisions of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act which would prohibit you from interstate shipment of a non-licensed medical device, but it doesn't exempt you from other laws like for radiologic health or for lasers or for all state laws, all kinds of other laws that might be out there. So IDEs also must comply with some labeling requirements. Now, IDEs are categorized as significant risk or non-significant risk devices that might be entered into an IDE. So two kinds of devices, a significant risk device or a non-significant risk. A significant risk device might be intended for use as an implant, present potential for serious health risks, or be used to support or sustain life. It may be of substantial importance in the diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of a disease. It might otherwise have a potential for serious risk. Some examples of these significant risk devices that might be used in an IDE are balloon catheters and ligaments or ocular lenses. Okay, those are significant risks when you take something and you stick it in your eye or you stick it in your body. Non-significant risks are, naturally, those devices which represent a much smaller risk but still could be used in the context of an IDE. An example of it might be a denture repair kit, okay? Or the general urologic catheters that have been used for a long time, or external monitors for insulin treatment. So significant risk devices have to meet all of the regulatory requirements to get approval for their IDE. There's a big role to play for the institutional review boards, and I talked a little bit about that when we talked about the drug review process. But the IRBs have to make two decisions, and they have to report it in for you to get your IDE. One is that they have to concur, decide whether or not the sponsor's claim that it's a significant or a non-significant risk device is indeed true. And the other is the IRB has to decide whether the investigation should be approved or not. So they have to go forward with that. The IRB decides if the study can be approved and whether the risk is significant or non-significant. The IRB has to be assured, regardless of which kind of device it is, that the risks are minimized and reasonable in relationship to the anticipated benefits. Okay? That the subject selection is equitable. By equitable, we mean we didn't exclude people on the basis of their race if there wasn't some good scientific reason to do that. We didn't exclude people on the basis of their gender or, increasingly, on the basis of their age. We want children who might have a disease to be included in clinical trials so we can learn something about how drugs work. So we can't, that the selection has to be equitable. That informed consent had to be adequate, that the study subjects knew what it was they were getting into, what the potential risks were and the potential benefits. And that monitoring and privacy protection is acceptable. If the IRB agrees that it's a non-significant risk and it's approvable, okay, that it's acceptable, that they can approve for the trial to be done in their institution, the investigation can go forward without FDA approval. Okay, so unlike with drugs, you've got this process whereby you don't have to get FDA approval if The IRB has said, no, this is not a significant risk device. However, the FDA retains the right to come in later and overrule the IRB, okay? So they have the legal capacity to do that. If the IRB says that there is a significant risk, then the sponsor has to notify the FDA of the risk determination. Some things are some things are exempt from the IDE. If, for example, it's non-invasive and there's no invasive diagnostic procedure that presents a significant risk, and it doesn't introduce any energy into the body, and there's no diagnostic procedure for a disease that's going on in the process, that this is being relied upon some device. They still have to comply with the IRB regulations, but they don't have to get an IND. And there are other IDE exemptions that are in your book that I'm not going to go into right now because they're a little more confusing. Your book goes over the content of the IDE. It's pretty formulaic, much like an IND. You've got to submit, and you've got to say your name and your address and all many different components to that form. The FDA has a refuse to accept policy, so they don't have to file everything if you don't fill out all the form properly. The FDA, like the IND, so you can see all these parallels to drugs, has 30 days to review it. If it's disapproved, the sponsor can request a hearing. If it's approved with conditions, the sponsor has 45 days to address the conditions of the approval. The investigational plan is important, the overall investigational plan, and FDA will review without any regard to class, so they're happy to review your investigational plan. Any agreement can be made, that is made for the investigational plan, has to be put, if the sponsor and FDA say, okay, well, we think that this is your plan, and if you show that you're going to demonstrate efficacy this way, then you can go forward. Well, it has to be put into writing and entered into the administrative record, and can only be changed with a written sponsor agreement or substantial scientific issue that comes up as determined by the office director of the Office of Device Evaluation. Okay? So most of the guidance, however, that the FDA offers, both in the device section and others, is really non-binding advice. Most of the times you go to the FDA, you're not going to be cutting a contract with them. You approve this if I do that. You're not going to be finding that too often. For drugs, and we didn't go over this in the drugs, it's called a SPA, a Special Protocol Agreement, I think it is. SPA. For devices, they have similar mechanisms, or homologous mechanisms, let's say. So IDE supplements, the question is, when do you need a new IDE and when do you need to put in a new supplement? How much has your device changed before you need to put in a new supplement? It's not especially clear, but the burden is upon the sponsor to recognize when his device has changed substantially, that a redetermination of substantial equivalence needs to be made. Investigational devices, which are granted under an IDE, have to be properly labeled. It has to say these words: caution, investigational device, limited by U.S. law to investigational use. And there's a whole bunch of other laws that also apply. So IDE investigators have to, so I wanted to mention just a little bit, because your book is so good on describing the difference between the investigator and the sponsor. Sometimes they are one, they are as one. You could be both the sponsor and the investigator, but if you are two different people, the IDE investigator is the person who's actually conducting the study, has to ensure contact, that the study is being conducted per the regulations. They have to get informed consent. They have to supervise the use of the device in this investigational context, and they have to return the unused devices. The sponsor has to get qualified investigators, has to get the IRB review, has to ensure that there's proper monitoring, and has to investigate any adverse events. I won't say adverse drug events because these aren't drugs, adverse events. Both the investigators and the sponsors have some reporting requirements. The investigators have to keep track of correspondence from the sponsor, have to keep dispositions of the devices, has to know where they were and how they were used, has to have the subject's case history and the device exposure history, has to have the informed consent. The investigator has to retain the informed consent, and has to have the protocol and any deviations from the protocols. The sponsors, in contrast, with regards to record keeping, has to keep correspondence with the investigators, with the FDA, with the IRBs, with other sponsors, and with monitors. The sponsor has to keep track of shipping and disposition of the devices, has to have signed investigator statements, has to have the names and address of each investigator, and the names and address of each IRB that's part of the process. You should know that there is a process for disbarring investigators if they are bad. There is this thing called scientific misconduct, and if you do scientific misconduct, they can whack you and they can say, no, you are no longer entitled to do any more clinical trials that could be period. Okay, so there is a disbarring process that's run by the Good Clinical Practice group up there in the Office of the Commissioner. Clinical trials have to be registered as well. You heard a little bit about clinicaltrials.gov, and they have to be registered for medical devices as well per FDA, the Food and Drug Amendments Act. Submissions have to be accompanied. So yes, submissions have to be accompanied by certification that you've had the thing registered publicly, and exactly which and who and when and which period of time are questions that I'll leave you to the book to research. But you should know that there's this process of registering your clinical trial. I want to mention now, so I said that the PMA and the 510K are the main mechanisms by which devices get to market. Another one, which my office used to administer, or co-administer, let's say, in the Office of Orphan Products, is the HUD, H-U-D, and I am not talking about housing and urban development. I am talking about the humanitarian use device and its sister process, the HDE. So the humanitarian device exemption. These two processes go together as one. They are both two halves of this process by which products for people with rare diseases, the medical devices for people with rare diseases, can get out into the market through the humanitarian device exemption. But it has to be for a rare disease or condition, and there are other rules about it. So it's only for the treatment of a disease or condition that affects fewer than 4,000 people per year. The device has to not be otherwise available. It can't expose patients to unreasonable risk, and the benefits have to outweigh the risk. Now that is a very different bar than the a substantial evidence of effectiveness bar that we have for drugs, right? Okay, substantial evidence of effectiveness from controlled clinical trials. That's a pretty high bar. The bar that the benefits probably outweigh the risk, that's a much lower bar. So this is in contrast to the Orphan Drug Act, which was all about saying, oh, we're going to get more orphan products we're going to keep the standard the same. They still have to be safe and effective to the same level, but we're going to make some incentives so that you get market exclusivity. That's what the Orphan Drug Act did, to try to make drugs available for people with rare diseases. Over here on the device side, to make devices available to people with rare diseases, we've looked at the efficacy standard and we've lowered it a bit, substantially actually. Okay? So there are two steps to getting a humanitarian device exemption. The first thing is you've got to apply to OOPD for a HUD, for a humanitarian use device, use designation, excuse me. A humanitarian use designation. I think I misspoke. It's late here. On the brief description of so you put in all the things, and the main thing is you have to demonstrate to OOPD that only 4,000 people per year could be using this device. Okay, that it really is a device for a rare disease or condition. So if you can do that, then the office, so this is co-administered by OOPD over in the Office of the Commissioner and the Office of Device Evaluation over there in CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health. They will then do the HDE component, and there are, of course, guidances for both of these things. Their evaluation is very similar to a PMA, but has much lower bar for evidence. So current issue, the issue is that it used to be, when I first came 4 years ago, it was one of the other rules for getting an HDE PMA was that you cannot make a profit. It was absolutely illegal. Naturally, you can imagine, and you actually had to have a CPA, a certified public accountant, testify to the fact that no, they can't make a profit, and they haven't made a profit from this device after looking at the books. So you can imagine that there was not a great deal of interest in the HDE or the Humanitarian Device Exemption, or the HUD, because it was specifically forbidden. Now, about a year ago or so, there was a change in FDA, I believe it was. Well, that was in 2007, so it was a few years back. That said, oh no, now you can make a device if it's for a pediatric device. So the pediatric devices, you can make a profit off of pediatric devices. Well, right now they are taking up this very same question about whether or not that profit-making capacity for these devices for rare diseases or conditions should be extended to adults as well. It hasn't settled out yet. It may within the next few months. We shall see. So laws are being made all the time. All right, let's talk a little bit about the 510K pre-market notification process. So as I mentioned, you have to have a predicate device. It's required before you make any major change or a change in how the device is used. If it requires a 510K, then it may not, you may not market the device until you receive an order, if it requires, because of its class, a 510K for pre-market, until you receive an order from the FDA stating that it is substantially equivalent to this predicate device. The contents are pretty formulaic. You just fill out the form. A substantial equivalence is the big deal here. That's the central theme that you need to get straight. You need to show that you're substantially equivalent. Software has special new rules, and there's special new guidances for any devices that involve software, like computer software. So pay attention to that. And biocompatibility has to be included as well. There is this notion of a hybrid 510K. You'll see this listed in the text. This means, okay, we're still doing a 510K, and we're still looking back at some predicate device, but because our technology is going a little bit different, we're going to kick in some extra clinical data just to show that we have reason to believe that it really is a predicate device, and this shows you that it's really substantially equivalent. It really is connected. You can see that it works just as well. The safety and efficacy is still there, but there's just a little bit of helpful data. That's called a hybrid 510K. So you must submit a new, I want to read here the exact language. You must submit the new 510K if, page 171, 191, if the modifications to the device that could, quote, could significantly affect the safety or effectiveness of the device, e.g. a significant change or modification in the design, material, chemical composition, energy source, or manufacturing process, or makes a major change or modification in the intended use of the device. Do that, you need a new 510K, okay? So it's hard to say because devices evolve. They're generally evolution, whereas molecular entities are revolutions of new inventions. Okay, so the 510K paradigm, a special abbreviated 510K when, okay, let me just skip over that for just a second. I do want you to know that the theme that resounds through all of this is that FDA can do almost anything that it wants to with regards to the regulation of devices. It can decide, so after it's reviewed your 510K, it can decide one of three things. It can say, yes, you're substantially equivalent to something that doesn't require a pre-market approval, and so you can go forward and market your device because yes, you're substantially equivalent to this other thing, and it doesn't require a pre-market approval, so you're ready to go forward. It can decide that you are not substantially equivalent, or NSE, or it can notify you that it needs more information in order to be able to decide, and ask you to go out and collect that information. It takes a long time. It's about 4 to 12 months to process a 510K, and the agency is directed by Congress to find, quote, the least burdensome means, and it's put some thought into how can we do this in the least burdensome way, least burdensome to the sponsor, not to the FDA, but to the sponsor for determining substantial equivalence. One such way that has come out is this issue of third-party review. And so in order to eliminate some of the backlog, CDRH has found accredited persons, gone out and accredited them, and said that they can review medical devices and provide answers to the agencies, opinions to the agencies as to what this is and whether or not there's substantial equivalence to some other device. It may not, however, review a Class 3 device or a Class 2 device that requires clinical data. And within 30 days of receiving the recommendation from the accredited party, FDA decides if it's substantially equivalent or not substantially equivalent. Okay, lastly, or towards the end, let's get to the PMA. This is the application in which the sponsor submits safety and effectiveness data from clinical trials, the full deal with the control, real patients treating them with this device, real patients not treating them with the device, and putting forward the efficacy data for the device. The review times are much longer and the cost is much higher, which is why everybody wants, if you got a device, they want a 510K. That's why we spend so much time on it here, is because it is the major means by which these devices have been approved. There is a table here that I really would like you to pay attention to on page 195. Which describes the 510K pre-market notification and the pre-market approval, PMA, pre-market approval, those two processes. So the first one, I'm just going to go over this really quickly right here. Devices subject to the requirement. So the 510K, it's a few Class 1s, most of the Class 2s, and some Class 3 pre-amendment devices. Okay, so most Class 3s are reserved over here. Over on pre-market approvals, all the Class 3 post-amendment devices and some Class 3 pre-amendment devices. The clinical data requirements for 510K, most are not supported by clinical data. Most 510Ks don't have clinical data. The hybrid 10K, as I mentioned, does include some clinical data. For PMAs, clinical studies are usually required to support the submission. Evidence of safety, information in 510K, information and data to support substantial equivalence of the device to a legally marketed predicate device. That's all the evidence that you need in order to get your device to market under 510K. But under PMA, it's clinical data and or scientific evidence supporting the safety and efficacy claims. Marketing rights, the 510K has no exclusivity. But a PMA is like a product license, so you've got your exclusivity associated with it, and your patent as well, of course. The average FDA review time for 510Ks is 54 days, 54 FDA days, and 95 total days. I don't know what the difference between FDA days and total days are. Maybe they count them differently. And I suppose we should look that up somehow. And if any of you know it in class, please let me know. However, PMAs, it's 283 FDA days or 335 total days. This was back in 2006. Regulations on device changes. You must file a new 510K if the change could, quote, significantly affect the safety or efficacy of the device. That's for a 510K. And then the regulation for the PMA, you have to file a brand new PMA or some form of PMA supplement or annual report depending on the nature and effect of the change on the safety and effectiveness of the device. So if you want to update things, it's a different process. Oh, I didn't mention advisory panels. As you know, the advisory panels are very important for FDA's processes. There's no advisory panel review for most 510K, almost all 510K devices. However, it almost always has a advisory panel if they are there's a review for some but not all PMAs. Generally no advisory panel for PMA supplements, but new devices tend to go to the PMA, go to the advisory committees. Okay, only a couple last comments will round out this lecture. There was a notion of a product development protocol as an alternative to a PMA. Okay, this is one of the, it's not a 510K, it's not a PMA, it's a new thing. It's very rarely used. It's very obscure. It has sort of this nice theory of sponsors and the agency are all going to work together and they're going to put out this thing and prove safety and efficacy, being no less stringent, but it's going to be very collaborative. Well, it tends not to work, and it's only been used a few times. It's not feasible for the sponsor, and it's overly demanding of the FDA. FDA is responsible for all medical and non-medical I wanted to put up the R in CDRH. Responsible for all medical and non-medical electronic products that emit ionizing or non-ionizing electromagnetic or particle radiation or sonic infrastructure or ultrasonic waves. And there are three, the regulations cover three different areas. I want you to know this. There are performance standards, how much radiation is emitted and how much might dose a person. There are reporting requirements that you have to report into the FDA about your production. And lastly, there are labeling requirements that your product has to have a certain label on it. With that, we have done an overview of device regulation, the approval process at least. Again, one could spend several weeks talking about this, but now you've got a good overview of how devices make it into the marketplace. We'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.